The program this afternoon is entitled Primitive Heart. And it's going to become obvious as we continue why we have entitled the program Primitive Heart. Both by the information that I will share with you of my own testimony, and of course I've shared some of that this morning, but I will make reference to what I've experienced as well during this seminar. Also through the scientific evidence which I'm going to share with you, musicological evidence that I'm going to share with you, and indeed as well through the evidence which the people themselves who are involved in the industry will share with you. I must confess that the two seminars I'm going to be sharing now are not my favorite ones to present, although the information is absolutely important. And the reason being is that a lot of the material is not really the most, how can I say, sometimes it's even depressive stuff. But it is necessary to share it so that you have the information. You need to know what we are experiencing today, where it comes from, in a musical sense, where it comes from, where the roots lie, so that you can understand what tree they've been picking their fruit from. And in fact, that reminds me of the text that Christ speaks about in Matthew chapter 7, where he says, by their fruits you will know them. Do men gather grapes of thorns or figs from thistles? Where is the concept, the ideas that we are dealing with today in the musical setting, where do they come from? Have they been inspired by God, or has the inspiration perhaps been gathered from somewhere else? In 1 John chapter 4, verse 1, of course, we read that where John says, Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but try or test the spirits, whether they are from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. It is our objective during the seminar this afternoon to test the spirits, to see where the inspiration comes from God, or perhaps from some other source entirely. Very important for us to know, because then we'll know whether what we are dealing with today is something which we can safely say it is God-inspired, and thus we can comfortably use it. We need to understand that. Maybe one of the first questions I'd like to pose at the beginning of this seminar, and that is, how far back does the history behind modern popular music go? And what modes of music can we put into the present popular music category? And of course the questions of why, when, wherefore, and so on come into the picture as well. And I'd also like to just reconfirm right at the very outset something that I said last night. Although I'm going to be dealing with a lot of elements that you find in contemporary music today, it does not mean, and I would like to emphasize, it does definitely not mean that everything that is contemporary or even popular is bad. There is a lot of good sound, a lot of good music that you can find in contemporary music, which basically means present day music. What we want to try and discover is, what are the bad elements we're dealing with? Where do they come from? How do they affect us? And of course, ultimately to find out whether we should avoid them or not. And then to find out later on, as we close off our seminars tomorrow, what are the elements that we can safely use and without causing detriment to the body temple, and of course bringing a bad name upon God's cause. So these are things we have to look at. But please bear in mind, I'm not uplifting any particular genre of music. I'm not condemning any particular genre of music, although if we deal with the seminars, there may be whole categories of music in the contemporary setting, which by their very nature, and because of how they are composed, by the composition of the material, the way in which the instruments are used, whatever you want to call it, that you may have to sacrifice those because they just don't fit in with God's plan. That may happen. But I'm not going to go out of my way. I'm actually going to I'm going to let history, musicology, science, and the very people in the industry themselves tell you exactly what it's all about. So that you won't be able to walk after the program and say, well, this guy Brian Neumann told us all this stuff. You're going to have to admit that they themselves tell you, and they will tell you absolutely with clarity, 100%. And then you have to make a decision, because they'll tell you where they're picking their fruit from. And of course, with regards to answering the question I just posed, is all of the vital elements that make modern popular music what it is today are almost as old as the history of this planet. Notice I say the vital elements, because there are some vital elements intrinsic to our expression in popular music forms which are extremely old. In fact, whether you're talking about blues, jazz, rock and roll, country rock, metal, thrash, punk, house music, rap, rave, techno, and of course today we have EMO, which is emotional rock music. We'll make mention of that today, one of the newest forms, although the concepts behind it are ancient. Any of these forms of music, they all fit into what we call the rock and roll music category. The rock and roll music industry calls itself exactly that, the rock and roll music industry. The reason being that the history of the rock and roll music goes back to the 50s. And the elements which were intrinsic to the early 50s music, and of course way beyond that, as you will see when we continue before that as we continue in our seminar, all these elements are still prevalent in the music today. So whether you're talking about blues or whether you're talking about rap, techno, rave, metal, any of the forms today, they are all part of the music which is available through the rock and roll music industry. So many times I may mention rock and roll. I'm not necessarily referring to Elvis Presley, Bill Haley and the Comets or Little Richard. I may be using that term generally to refer to the musical industry, the rock and roll music industry, which incorporates all these forms of music that I have on the screen here. And in all their various forms, they share a vital link with the ancient past that ties them all together. That's the link we want to discover this afternoon. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is what we are hearing in our popular music today, the elements which I will be discussing this afternoon are not something new. Absolutely not new. When Elvis Presley or Bill Haley and the Comets came out in the early 1950s and Little Richard, the pioneers of that genre of rock and roll, they were not presenting to the world something new. It became more public and more knowledge. But this had been around for, let me put it to this way, not for a few centuries, not for a few decades, but the concepts behind those music have been around for thousands and thousands of years. That's how old it is. We'll discover what they are. And so, of course, the question would be is what is this vital link then that all these modes of music share? What is that vital link? Well, it goes right back, as I've said, for thousands of years. And it actually has to do with the fact that in ancient shamanic rituals, in ancient pagan worship, if I may use that term, music was used as an intrinsic part of the worship atmosphere. Now, of course, you and I know that in our Christian setting, music is also an intrinsic part of our worship, right? But in pagan worship, the characteristics of the music that were used in pagan worship to elicit the kind of response from the worshippers as they worship the deities that we will be discussing, some of them this afternoon, was a different type of musical atmosphere to what you found being used in the worship to God. We read in Jonathan Goldman's book, Healing Sounds, The Power of Harmonics, where he writes about some of the ancient origins. He says the use of music in sacred ceremonies and shamanic rituals has occurred since ancient times. It has recently been verified that sound can be used to affect and change our brain waves. Now, you'll remember last night we saw in our seminar that music is not just something that you listen to. Music has an indelible effect on you. It affects you on an emotional level. And we discussed those issues. And for those of you who were not here last night for that seminar, we are redoing it because of the sound that we didn't get last night. And 10:30 tomorrow morning, if you missed the seminar last night, we'll be presenting it here tomorrow morning at 10:30. The same thing all over again. And if you want to hear it again, you're welcome as well. But anyway, the changes of these rates in the music creates changes in consciousness, allowing what they call mystically altered states to be induced. The relationship between occult wisdom and sound may at first seem far removed, yet in the ancient mystery schools of Egypt, Rome, Greece, Tibet, India, and many other centers of learning, the knowledge of sound was a highly refined science. And indeed, as you will see in our seminar today, it is a science. A highly refined one, as we find it in our present form. In the primitive form, certainly refined and very effective for what it was used for. But today it has become, through the way in which it is utilized through the media and the modern popular music scene, a very highly refined science. But we want to find out in our seminar, and pose it in the form of a question here, what are the elements of this highly refined science? What are these elements in the music that I'm talking about that can actually accomplish what Jonathan Goldman has been telling us about? And can we still see it practiced today in our present situation? Very important to answer those questions. First of all, one of the elements that we are dealing with, although it may not directly seem to be associated with music, you will discover that it is actually associated, has to do with the whole concept of sun worship. And much of what I'm going to share with you regarding this issue of sun worship and how prevalent it is even in our present day was is found in a book that was put out by UNESCO, which is an arm of the United Nations. And in fact, Federico Meyer, who is the Director General of UNESCO, commissioned the research, and he does the foreword in the book, The Sun in Myth and Art. So it's a highly researched book and highly recommended by none other than UNESCO itself. In fact, speaking about the sun god power, this is what Federico Meyer says. He says, as the bestower of light and life, ancient cultures generally identified the sun as the symbol of truth. The all-seeing eye, the one eye, as we know it in Egyptology as being the eye of Osiris, the all-seeing eye of Lucifer, of course, who is the sun god, the all-seeing eye of justice and equality, the fountainhead of wisdom, compassion, and enlightenment, the healer of physical and spiritual maladies, and above all, the fundamental source of fecundity, growth, and fruition, as well as of death and the renewal of life. And of course, sun god worship is always related or associated with fertility and sexuality and so on. He goes on to tell us that the lighting of fires in some of the ancient rituals, the jumping over them, the dancing around a tree or central pole during the winter and summer solstices have connotations similar to the lighting of the Olympic torch and to the runner carrying the sun symbol from one location of the games to the other. You'll find that the aspects found in sun worship are prevalent in just about every single aspect of our present-day lives, including the music as well. And so and by the way, sun worship was not something which was prevalent only in the Middle East or the Far East. It is prevalent there today still, or prevalent in the pagan nations surrounding Israel and the Baal worshippers and so on. Sun worship was right across Europe. The ancient Druidic rituals involved sun worship. It was there in European worship. It was there in South America, North America. You can go right down to Australia, to the Aborigines. In every single culture around the world where people are worshipping some other deity other than our monotheistic worship of God, they are practicing sun worship. It is intrinsic to their religions. And the reason being is that the root of all these religions was actually founded right back in the time after the flood at the Tower of Babel. They were all worshipping the sun god. The Bible writes about Nimrod, who was a mighty warrior before the Lord, in other words, against God. And when he died, as I mentioned in my seminar this morning, his wife claimed that she became impregnated by him because he became the sun god, and then she gave birth to his child, who in turn was a regurgitation of the sun god himself. This is how it all started. When the languages were confused at the Tower of Babel, all these different religions went to different parts of the world. But they carried with them these intrinsic doctrines, particularly relating to the sun god, and went around the world and continued these practices in their different cultures. This is why it is prevalent around the world. For example, in the river Ganges in India, you will find that this is the custom that in the morning they will greet the sun god as the sun rises by raising their hands in prayers to the sun god. Some of the other prayers they do, which is interesting, of course we do it very often as Christians today, but it was adopted from pagan custom, was that the pagans used to pray with their hands together, which was another prayer which they used in reverence, as it were, to the sun god deity. In Africa, sun god worship is practiced wherever you go. You can go from North Africa, Egypt, all the way right down to Southern Africa, where I come from. Sun worship is an important part of this. And in many of the masks which you see here, you see representations of the Tabwa mask with a central solar motive. You'll see the red square around there, if I may show you with the arrow. In the middle, you will see the solar disk. Often the sun is either represented as a disk with the sun flares or just a pure round disk, the solar disk. And there you will see it encompassed by the triangular, where is my arrow? There it is. By this triangular shape here, which actually represents the moon in its quarter shape, in its rounded shape, the moon, which actually represents the womb of the mother. The sun is the sun god. The sun god is going in to fertilize, as it were, the moon, the mother, which is the mother part of the deity, and of course from that the sun god is born. The sun rarely appears in its anthropomorphic form, but makes its power felt through a variety of different masks, and all of these have, in some or other way, sun representations. Here you will see the yellow circle, or the shape of the sun with the flares around it. They come in different types of manifestations. Throughout Africa, for example, here you will see a very good picture of the female deity. Here, the moon, and then of course the star, which represents the sun as well, going into the moon there. And of course all these things, here this woman's breastplates, whatever you want to call it, that she's wearing, also representing the solar discs. It forms part of the fashion, it forms part of the religion. In fact, you cannot separate African religion, pagan religion, from the fashion, because they are all melded together. Interestingly enough, also in the UNESCO book which was commissioned, speaking about the Olympic torch, of course, comes from the original Greek games, which were actually in dedication to the god Zeus. The Olympic torch, which the runner carries to mark the sun's cyclic movement throughout the Olympiad, the 4-year period until the next games, is also related to the sun's cyclic rhythm. First celebrated in Greece, the games were ceremonial contests in honor of the god Zeus. And that is why if you took a look at what was happening at the Barcelona games, and of course in Australia with the Aborigines as well, they normally have the local religions doing some kind of presentation at the Olympic Games, because those local religions are still worshipping the sun god deity. And that's why you will see the other planets, the planets floating overhead at the Barcelona Olympic Games, and the sun's association with the sports, particularly the Olympic sports, predates the deities Hercules and Apollo in Greece, and so on. So sun god religion is something which is around us all the time. Maybe people aren't worshipping the sun god per se, but we are having contact with the concept all the time in our day-to-day experience. Of course, these are just interesting things to know, but the question is how did pagan sun worship become integrated into our modern music forms? Because after all, this is the issue that we're dealing with today. How's the connection made? Okay. I'm going to go back to a type of practice which found its roots in Africa, but of course the roots are far older than just Africa itself, which commonly to Westerners has become known as voodoo ritual. Now all these ancient pagan religions, as I say, worship the sun god, and in voodoo ritual it's no different. The voodoo ritual takes place in honor of the sun god deity. And what the follower of voodoo does is he seeks to incorporate a lower or a lesser god, that's what it is, into himself, by writhing and leaping through a dance while these drums that they're playing at the ceremony bang out complex rhythms. Now, when just the right rhythm is found for an individual lesser god, the dancer then takes up that rhythm, and then the lesser god, the spirit being, was, they would call it in Africa, the spirits of the ancestors, and as we know it to be demons, will enter into his soul. His physical and mental powers are immediately heightened. He becomes godlike himself. And then at the ceremonies, animals will be sacrificed to appease the spirits. In some of the ancient pagan religions, they would have human sacrifices, and terrible things went on there. The religion is strictly Dionysian, which means it is sensual and totally unrestrained. And the dances often end in wholesale copulation. And to call a spade in a sexual orgy, that's what they end in. There are actually 3 main elements, which one is not mentioned here right now, that you find in voodoo ritual worship. And that is the musical aspect, which helped to facilitate, and we'll study that in more detail just now, the actual experience. You will find the sexual aspect in the worship, and you will also find the aspect of herbs or drugs that are used to heighten the experience. For example, here's a quote by M. Harnish about shamans, page 49. He writes, "Shamans take mind-altering substances. Some degree of alteration of consciousness is necessary for shamanic practice. With a combination of these things, the experience is heightened, and of course, they go into what they call a state of trance, and then the demon or the spirit of the ancestor, whatever you like to call it, enters in and then works through them." And just speaking about the drug aspect, it is very interesting. Psychiatrist Stanislav Grof, a pioneer researcher into LSD and altered states, reports that some of the LSD subjects he has studied have had encounters with astral bodies. And in some cases, this has led to the characteristics of demon possession. Now, this is, of course, no surprise, because this type of idea has been used in pagan practice for many, many years. And it's interesting when you look at the 3 elements that are contained in voodoo ritual worship: the sexuality, the music, or the elements of the music that are involved in that, and the drugs, that those are exactly the 3 aspects which are actually told to us are inherent in our modern popular music forms, in the popular music industry. The slogan of the popular music industry is sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Their own slogan, which they coined themselves. In fact, they've written songs about it, and it comes from the industry itself. Sex, drugs, rock and roll, in other words, sex, drugs, and music. The 3 elements you find in voodoo ritual are the same 3 elements that are inherent in much of what we call rock and roll today. Just an interesting statement from Jimi Hendrix's, go back one step, from Jimi Hendrix's ex-girlfriend, Thane Pridgeon, she writes about the fact that he always used to talk about some devil that was in him, and he didn't have any control over it. He didn't know what made him act the way that he acted, and songs just seemed to come out of him, almost sometimes like they were dictated. Particularly Jimi Hendrix used to speak about the fact that when he was live on stage, it would feel like some other force took over, and the music would just flow out of him as if he almost became an observer to what he was doing on stage. And again, in my own experience, I can testify to that because I've had that same out-of-body kind of experience performing live in front of audiences myself during my career. He was so tormented, she says, and just torn apart, and he used to talk about having someone drive this demon out of him. It is interesting that these people who talk about this stuff, who are involved in it, themselves recognize that there is something that is possessing them that is not just themselves. Something which is working through them that they have no control over, but rather which has control over them. Another interesting statement here by John Kilmo regarding the whole issue of channeling. He writes, and basically this is a book about investigations on receiving information from paranormal sources. He says, if your mind can affect your brain, then the similar non-physical nature of another mind might also be able to affect your brain if it is in a state of receptivity. Let me pause there for a moment. Where have you seen this kind of thing happen, where another mind controls somebody else's mind where they're in a state of receptivity? Where have you seen that? Hypnosis. Exactly, that's what we're talking about. That's why I believe, and I know, and we can read about a lot of this in the testimonies, that hypnosis is a very dangerous thing to allow yourself to be put under. Very dangerous. Because you are open to the power of suggestion from an outside source, and you have no control, conscious control, as to whether you will refuse to react to what is being presented to you. But anyway, that's very interesting, and I think we need to take heed to some of that instruction which we read there. It goes on to say, giving rise to you hearing a voice, seeing a vision, having another mind speak or write through you by controlling your body the same way that you would normally control your own body. And this is exactly what happened to Jimi Hendrix. An out-of-body experience controlled by some outside force. Now, this is exactly, of course, what happens in pagan ritual worship, where the deity comes in, takes possession, and then you are under the control of the deity, the lesser god, that is dictating to you what you should do. Some other forms, David Hunt writing about this in the book The Occult Invasion, he says, the practice of yoga and other forms of Eastern meditation creates the same altered states as do drugs, hypnosis, drumming, dancing, visualization, and other shamanic practices now so widely used in the West. So many of these practices which we think today are innocent, like hypnosis and perhaps meditation. And I'm not talking about the biblical definition of meditation, I'm talking about the Eastern concept of meditation. All of these invoke or cause the same state of mind to come about as we have just described happen in pagan ritual services. Now, having spoken about pagan ritual and voodoo, we want to know what the philosophy is behind it and what this religion is all about. And as we go through this religion, of which music plays a very intrinsic part, we're going to understand and see very clearly the connection we are making with our present situation. To tribal peoples, and of course I've referred to pagan worship in its various settings. What I'm going to describe to you now took place in Egypt. Egyptology took place in Europe, in their pagan ritual worship services. All over the world, the same elements are involved. But because these elements came back into Western society, which largely had been Christianized from AD right all the way through to our present time, because it came through Africa once again, I'm going to specifically talk about the African connection. So I'm going to talk about the African voodoo rituals and so on and what they believe. But the belief system is the same in all pagan ritual worships. The intrinsic elements are there. Right. So to tribal peoples, religious worship is seen as a bodily celebration. It involves everything. It is a physical celebration. You'll remember we looked at the three elements in music last night. Melody, harmony, and rhythm. Melody we listen to with the more spiritual part of the brain that deals with the spiritual. The harmony we listen to with the more intellectual part of the brain that is stimulated, because harmony is the more complex structure in music. And of course, rhythm we hear in the music, which is not a bad part of music, it's a good part of music, necessary in music. Rhythm, though, we respond to when it's accentuated, particularly on the more physical level. That's why we dance to music where rhythm is accentuated. Whether it be classical, whether it be contemporary, whatever it may be, the rhythm is the part that elicits the activity of dancing. Now, to pagan ritual worshippers, the rhythm is the most intrinsic part because it is the physical aspect of worship which for them is very important. The physical is accentuated. Okay. And they believe in African worship and in pagan worship in the crossroads of the physical and the spiritual worlds. Now, what does that mean? That means that in their worship service, through the process of the music and the whole atmosphere that is being created, they will reach a point, as we saw in the voodoo ritual description, where they reach the crossroads between the physical and spiritual worlds, and that is where the spirits come in and possess the person who is worshipping. That's the crossroads. That's why in most pagan religions, you will find that the symbol they use is the sign of the cross. You can go to South America, to India, you can go to the Aztecs, you can go down to Australia, you can go to the Far East, wherever you go. The sign of the cross has been an important symbol in pagan worship because it represents the crossroads between the physical and the spiritual. In other words, it represents the sun god deity, which is none other than Satan himself, or Lucifer. And of course, we have to understand the connotations that they attach to the cross, because in Christianity we attach some connotations to the cross as well. But the whole idea is totally different from the pagan connection. Now, I mentioned to you earlier on that the drum was viewed by pagan worshippers, and is so done in Africa as well, as the supreme symbol of the sun god deity, their most important god. And the tightly stretched skin over the drum represents the tightly stretched stomach of the mother ready to give birth to the sun god child. Very important to know these things, because that is why I mentioned to you in the seminar this morning, this is one of the reasons why the drum was not used in the sanctuary, because it was actually an idol, and God did not want an idol in the sanctuary. The African drums are considered sacred in the pagan setting. They are washed, put to rest, and they are worshipped as deities. And this, of course, comes from some of the best historical sources that you can get on these. And of course, if you live in Africa, you will know these things because you're surrounded by this much of the time. The belief is that the drums are actually the ears of the gods, and that they must be played with the attitude that you are speaking to the gods on behalf of humanity. And of course, the drummers are recognized as the high priests, and so the drummers in the religious ceremonies will not begin until the drummers have been saluted by the dancers. Of course, in voodoo ritual, everybody becomes a part of the ceremony. There are no bystanders at a voodoo ritual. So they all end up taking part in the actual ceremony that takes place. Now, here's a very important part of the program which I want to explain to you as carefully and in as much detail as I can. And I'm going to try and use some practical demonstrations as well. But before I do that, let me read this quote to you. Each percussive or vocal part has a highly different rhythm. Now, we're talking about the drums and how they are used in the voodoo ceremony. Okay. I want to answer the question, you see, of the highly refined science that is involved in creating the religious atmosphere for the manifestation of the crossroads experience. Right. So each percussive or vocal part has a slightly different rhythm which coincides with and sometimes crosses the other rhythms, or what they call the guiding pulse, at strategic moments. The drummers often shuffle their feet or sway their bodies in dance-like motions to assist them in maintaining contact with the main beat, that's the guiding pulse, especially when the rhythm is syncopated. During these rituals that still take place in the Congo and Yoruba land, listen to this part of the sentence very carefully. It is the intricate layers of the multiple rhythmic drumming that are considered a primary source, and I might say the primary source, of the occult power of the crossroads experience. Now, what is this all about? For those of us who are not au fait or aware of how these things work, you may be sitting there saying, well, it's good to read this stuff, but what does it mean? I mean, okay, they use drums and rhythms and they go into this state of mind, hypnotic trance state of mind, but how does it work? So I want to explain to you in as much detail as I can, and hopefully in as little time as possible, exactly how the process works. And try and make some associations with things that you are familiar with as well in your present time. And I'd like to also tell you right at the outset that what we are going to find out is used in these musical elements in voodoo ritual are prevalent in just about every form of music we find today on the planet. We'll see why in a moment. Okay. Hang on to your seats. Okay. First of all, let's discuss the issue of the guiding pulse. The guiding pulse is a very important part of this. You will normally find one or two of the musicians or the drummers are banging out, let's say, a guiding pulse that may go something like this. Constantly over and over and over and over. The other drummers are now going to play different rhythms in between, if I may put it in simple language, in between that guiding pulse. Now, of course, mention is major to the syncopated rhythm. A lot of people ask me, well, what do you mean by syncopated rhythm? In most of our Western music forms, as they are found in the classical type of setting, the emphasis is normally placed on the beginning of the bar, on the first beat of the bar. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, for example. But when you talk about a syncopated rhythm, the emphasis is normally placed on the offbeat. So it may be 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So the rhythm may go, the guiding pulse may be going doof, doof, doof. But the syncopated rhythm will be going doof, ta, doof, ta, doof, ta. The emphasis, of course, being on the ta, which is syncopated. That is, though, a very simplified explanation of what syncopated is. You will find in most popular forms of music, that is the rhythm which is used. Doof, ta, doof, ta, doof, ta. Okay, a very simple example. There are variations. There are many other rhythms. For example, a drummer who is playing his drums on stage may be using different cymbals and the toms and other instruments to create other interplaying rhythms that coincide with this guiding pulse. So you may be having the doof-ta going, but there may be other rhythms going doof-ta-ta-ta, doof-ta-ta in between all those rhythms. Okay, if that makes any sense to anybody who's not a drummer, I don't know. But I'm going to give you some practical examples of how it works as well. In fact, I'm going to let you hear some music as it may be found in a voodoo ritual I'll play for you. But now, how does it work? Because the whole concept of voodoo ritual and the music used is to try and get the people into what they call a state of trance. What is trance? Trance is basically another word for a state of hypnosis. That's basically what it is. This meditative frame of mind. And there are larger or higher and lesser degrees of trance. Not everybody who is exposed to these influences, these elements in the music, will just fall down and go into a state of trance and become, as it were, visibly possessed by a demon. That doesn't happen. But to a larger or lesser degree, your senses of the conscious mind are numbed and the state is induced. Right. Whether you realize it consciously or not. We'll discuss that from a scientific point of view just now. Now I'm going to try and explain this in simple terms. The thing in the rhythms, the syncopated rhythms, the thing that actually induces the trance state of mind in this whole experience is the guiding repetitious pulse. Over and over and over and over and over. Let's talk about that rhythmical principle for a moment. A hypnotist, now we'll go back to something that we can associate with. A hypnotist often uses in the process of trying to hypnotize somebody, what they call a pendulum. The pendulum is used because the pendulum swings backwards and forwards, backwards in a rhythmical, repetitious motion all the time, which helps to induce the hypnotic state of mind. Rhythm is monotonous repetition, plays a very important role in inducing trance or hypnosis. That's very important. So you will have this pendulum swinging, and then of course, the person who is actually trying to induce the state of hypnosis will speak in a particular tone of voice. Very level, in other words, monotonous type of tone of voice. All these principles are important. Keep them under your hat, because this is what causes the state of trance. Okay. But there is something else that today is being practiced in hypnosis, which also works just as well to induce the state of trance. And that is a constant pulse, just a literal pulse that goes doof, 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 doof. And they have seen that that also helps to induce a state of trance. This is why you will find in many of the music forms, I'll make reference to it later on in our seminars. But it's interesting when you get to many of the modern music forms. For example, in the areas of music like rave, techno, and rap and others, that reference is often made by the people making the music themselves, that the music is actually associated with trance-like state. Many of the songs have titles which refer to trance. Many of the albums are called trance dance music because they understand the concept behind it. And this is what made the pagan ritual such a diabolical success, was the fact that the elements of trance and repetition in the music were there to help put them in that state of mind where ultimately the crossroads experience would be induced. Now, there is the other aspect, though, to the rhythm as well, and that has to do with the syncopation. There is something very interesting that takes place in the human brain when you combine constant repetition with syncopated rhythm, that offbeat type of rhythm. Right. What takes place? They have noticed in scientific research, I'm going to give you some of the scientific research, but I'm first going to describe it to you. And this, by the way, is from the best scientific sources in the world. And all the research that is being done today confirms this 100% from the best institutions around the globe. Okay, but listen to what happens. What they have found out is that when you are exposed to repetitious syncopated rhythm, there is a friction which takes place between the right and left cerebral hemispheres of the brain. It causes a feeling of kind of excitement. You might feel a kind of adrenaline rush. That is why, for example, when people hear syncopated music, repetitious, they want to dance because of the syncopated style of rhythm. And it's interesting. For example, the way in which the body moves when you are exposed to syncopated music and dance with it, because the body actually would show you in the movements that there is this friction that is taking place. That is why you will notice when the emphasis is placed on the first beat of music. Give you an example. Classical music normally emphasizes, as I mentioned, the first beat of the bar. It also uses syncopation sometimes. I'm not knocking syncopation, by the way. Syncopation is used as a means of expression in all kinds of music. You'll even find syncopation in some of our songs in our hymn books. I'm talking about constant repetitious syncopation. So don't be scared of syncopation. It's a means of expression. But I'm talking about it in this setting, right? So this constant repetitious syncopation that is used causes this friction. And when people dance, the body has this kind of motion. I can't put it into words, and I'm not going to dance for you either. But whereas in classical dancing, you will see the movements of the dancers, for example, in classical dancing, are very lateral when they dance. Whereas when you look at the movements of people who are dancing in syncopated music, they are more erratic and they are not lateral in motion. In fact, you will notice very immediately that the hips loosen up. You can't dance to classical music like that. Forget it. You'd look ridiculous. And by the way, you can't do classical dancing to that kind of rhythm either, because you'd also look ridiculous. Because the whole message that is sent to the brain sends this friction message. And what happens here is this, and this is what is so important. And this gets back to the whole concept of the body-temple principle. This friction that is caused in the brain actually has a profound effect on the nervous system of the body. They have discovered now, remember I read a statement last night from the British Performing Arts Trust where they did a survey. All the musicians, or the majority of them that they have found and surveyed that were in the music scene from the early days, are having problems like nervous breakdown problems. They are having problems like shaking, loss of concentration, or under medication, have to see psychiatrists and so on to deal with some of these problems. What they're discovering today is that this is directly related to the overexposure of syncopated repetitious rhythms, because they break down the nervous system. Not only that, it has an indelible effect on your blood pressure, your heart rate, the function of the glands of the body, and so on. Now, some people say, but hey, I feel good when I hear those rhythms. I want to dance, I feel good. Of course you do, because you're getting this adrenaline rush, the friction's going there, and there is this excitement that is caused. But the question you have to ask yourself is, everything that makes me feel good, is it good for me? And this is the point, that some of these rhythms which are used and inducing this type of experience ultimately serve the purpose of destroying your body, particularly your nervous system. Another interesting bit of information which comes from the scientific fraternity, and I'll show you from their own sources, is that when you are exposed to syncopated rhythm all the time when you are listening to syncopated rhythm, your heart is malfunctioning. Wow, did you know that? You can try it out yourself. I'll give you a case study. And by the way, every time you do it, your blood pressure goes up as well. You can listen to a piece of music, or you can sit down before you listen to syncopated music. I wouldn't advise doing it all the time, but you can sit down and listen to nothing at first. Just sit down, put a blood pressure cuff on, relax, take your blood pressure as it would normally be, without doing any physical exercise. Put on a syncopated, repetitious rhythm. Within minutes, your blood pressure just goes right up, without doing anything else at all. Not only that, as I say, but your heart starts to malfunction as well. That, of course, is causing the state of excitement. Now, what happens is this. Case study. A mother took her young daughter to the hospital to have a growth removed from her finger. Local anesthetic was used. They hooked her up onto a heart monitor for whatever reason it may have been. And of course, this is not the only case studies. This goes on in experimentation all the time. But in this case study, hooked her up onto the heart monitor. The doctors were highly surprised, and the nurses, as they were doing the operation, because they realized that the heart monitor was showing that the girl's heart was malfunctioning. And they couldn't understand why. Of course, they discussed it with the mother while they were busy and said, do you have any record or history or knowledge of the fact that your daughter had heart problems? The mother said, no, I have no idea. She's pretty normal. What happened is they decided to take off the headphones she was wearing while she was having the operation, because to distract herself from their operation, she was wearing her Walkman and listening to the music. And of course she was listening to repetitious syncopated rhythms of whatever group she was listening to. The minute they took off the headphones, within seconds her heart rate came back to normal again. Put them back on, heart rate malfunctions again, shown on the heart monitor. Now, this is interesting, and I'll tell you why. Because the object of physical exercise, and I say this with reference to the fact that many people are using syncopated repetitious rhythms for exercise. People go jogging with it because it actually helps to make you feel adrenalized. People do aerobics with this all the time. But they don't realize that your heart is malfunctioning all the time while you're doing it, and the object of exercise is actually to improve your heart, not to break it down. And today, some of the latest scientific literature that is put out, and I have reams of literature in my house from the best scientific sources. They are actually warning people, do not go jogging when you are listening to syncopated music over your headphones or exercise with it. Because if you have heart problems, you can actually induce a heart attack without realizing what you are doing. Now, of course, all these things are interlinked. It has an effect on the heart, it has an effect on the nervous system and so on, which in the long term breaks down. I ask you the question, is this something, when you take into account the body-temple principle, just that on its own, forget about all the other origins and the history behind it, which a Christian should be exposing himself to? Paul says, if you destroy the temple of God, him shall God destroy. For the temple of God is holy, which temple you are. This is why in voodoo ritual, the aspect of trance facilitates that state of mind, and then the syncopation causes that excitement, and that is why most of these ceremonies end in orgies, sexual rituals, and so on. It causes a state of excitement, a state of what we may call sensuality to be induced. Just as an example, for you to hear in a recording, and I hope this isn't going to be too loud, just keep an eye on that, Valentine, please. A recording of the type of sound you will hear in a voodoo ritual. There are many examples, this is just one idea. You will hear the piece of music start off with a guiding doof, doof, pulse, and then you will hear other rhythms interplaying with it as well. That's okay. Of course, the pulse is going all the way through consistently. Okay, we don't want to listen to too much of it, but that's the idea of the rhythms, and you can hear without me trying to do it by syllabic vocalization. And that's a term which is used in the ancient voodoo ritual as well, syllabic vocalization. Have you ever heard of something called syllabic vocalization? Syllabic vocalization is what they used to do in voodoo ritual, where they would actually do a kind of a chant, or may I call it a rap, on top of the rhythms that are being played. And what we term today as rap music, which is purely focused on the rhythm, actually finds its roots in voodoo ritual worship music. Because syllabic vocalization was an important part of the voodoo ritual service, where the leader or the person in the worship service would do syllabic vocalization, in other words, rap on top of the rhythms. And that's exactly what rap is. It's the same form, but in modern type of setting. Now, everything I've been telling you, by the way, with regards to the historical connection and the voodoo roots, I'm going to let a band talk to you now. The band is known as the Wayward Shamans, very up-and-coming popular band who spent a number of years, they're a drumming band, who spent a number of years researching the rhythms in ritual pagan worship. And on this radio interview, they're going to tell you exactly what I've been telling you, by the way. So this comes from the industry itself. On National Public Radio, on an interview entitled All Things Considered, this is what the band says. Very interesting. Listen to it very carefully. 7th of October, 2002. Let me just get my little arrow down here to activate it. Okay.
We asked Barrett and Cripps to bring the band here to NPR's.
It's a fairly long interview, so just listen carefully.
Demonstrate how they create their music. Layers of horns and guitars and percussion on top of ancient beats.
One of the guys that we studied with, a Santeria drum priest named One Kumbatoris, took Joe and I in and taught us several of the primary Santeria rhythms for the different Orishas, or gods, within the Santeria pantheon. And so this particular rhythm is for the Orisha Ogun, and we used it as a loop to create the foundation for the song Maria Santeria.
Why don't you just give us the rhythm?
Okay.
Just give us an example first, and maybe you want to describe a little bit more about it.
All right.
So Joe, what attracts you to this rhythm? I mean, what was it that made you say, we're going to use that in a song?
When we did this in Cuba and got with One, the guy that was teaching us this, there are 3 drummers there. We're all playing drums that have 2 different tones. The heads are different sizes on each drum, and then the drums are all different sizes. So we've adapted this down today to the kind of the essence of that rhythm. Once we got back to the States and are listening to the recordings we made and all, just ideas start coming from it, and Barrett put together the music, over the top of that rhythm.
Well, why don't we hear how you've adapted it? Let's hear the song Maria Santeria.
Just a portion of the song they'll play, so bear with it. And of course you will hear the principles of repetitious, syncopated rhythms being played all the time. And of course the whole concept of monotony in the music itself as well. And of course this is nothing new. We've heard it in contemporary music for many years. In fact, some of these atmospheres were very popular in Carlos Santana's music. Very famous musician, even in our present time.
So anyway, that's an example of how we took a field recording and used an ancient primary rhythm as a foundation to create a modern composition.
And when you hear it in the field, you're hearing multiple drummers, many drummers at a time playing 4/4, 6/8, and maybe other rhythms even on top of that and interlaced with it.
Yeah, well, that's why, the main reason for that is that those rhythms pull down the gods, or the Orishas, and project them into the dancers. That's the primary reason of those rhythms, is to actually pull down these spirit deities and have them speak to the people.
And there's a specific rhythm to call each of these deities.
Exactly. And that's what Santeria and Candomblé and Voodoo, and also Garifuna, the people on the coast of Belize. They have their own system or pantheon that they call Garifuna.
Exactly. It all goes back to West African religion, Yoruba and other ethnic groups. The religions basically are the same, they differentiate a little bit, but they've used the same system, same deities, and the rhythms have changed some, but that's basically the same thing.
And one of the things I think is important to point out, and Joe and I kind of joke about this being drummers, but it really had a lot to do with the influence of the Catholic Church, because here in the United States this was a Protestant culture, and pretty much all the Protestant cultures burned the drums, but the Catholics realized that by allowing the drums to be played and those folkloric rhythms and traditions to be kept, it merged with Catholicism.
You mentioned Garifuna and Belize. Let's hear some of the rhythm in the Garifuna rhythm.
This is one more example. Perfect rock rhythm, you'll hear it coming in. And there you see the emphasis on the offbeat. Ta, 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 all the way through the music. Okay, so basically what that does is it confirms here from a group that is particularly involved in rhythms itself. They tell you exactly what I've been telling you. Popular group of the day, which are telling you where it comes from, what it's all about, what the purpose of the music is, and you can hear by their own illustrations. And especially this last piece as well, where the rhythm which you are hearing is the same rhythm which was inherent in the very early days of the rock and roll music scene. It's the whole, but we'll hear more of the evidence from them themselves as we continue. But just quickly to some of the scientific evidence. And just for interest's sake, John Fuller in his book, speaking about are the kids all right, before I go to some of the more hardcore scientific evidence, he says, rock music in particular has been demonstrated to be both powerful and addictive, as well as capable of producing a subtle form of hypnosis or trance, in which the subject, though not completely under trance, is still in a highly suggestive state. Sound effects by Firth, writing about the sexuality of music, they say that the sexuality of music is usually referred to in terms of its rhythm, because that's the physical aspect of the musical category. It is the beat that commands a directly physical response. The perception of rhythm involves the whole organism in the book The Psychology of Music. Rhythm is a primary factor in determining the kind of effect produced on the emotions. Not only is the effect determined by the rhythm being pronounced or not, but if it is fast, moderate, or slow. Just regards to the effect of rhythms, and that's by Hughes regarding rhythm and health. Tempo and rhythms were definitely the most important element in creating an emotional response in the research which they did. And of course, yeah, speaking about the sensory motor reaction, which we discussed last night in the research that Willem de Waal did in Music in Hospitals, very important book in this area of research. He says it has been found that music that is strongly rhythmical may set up a sensory motor reaction. They found as well that if you actually they've done experiments in mental hospitals where people who are mentally incapacitated, if I may use the term, where if they are played music that is soothing, they relax, they are able to communicate with the person and they are soothed. But the minute they put on something which is syncopated, the person goes into erratic state, they can't talk to them, they can do nothing with them. Because of course in a person who is mentally incapacitated, it's manifest far more quickly and far more easily than in somebody who is totally normal. Speaking about music's effects, music elicits unconscious reactions. Pleasant melodies of all sorts are said to lift depression, relieve anxiety, reduce pain associated with cancer. Notice they say pleasant melodies, which is quite interesting. Neurologists acknowledge that sound can indeed provoke the nervous system, as I've already told you. So scientists show this very clearly. High-frequency sound waves can trigger audiogenic seizures. There are certain sounds that you can use, and they've applied these, done this with rhythms as well. And the emotional reactions to music can cause what they call musicogenic seizures, which is basically a form of epilepsy, epileptic fit. Practicing a musical instrument physically changes the structure of your brain. That is why it's very important for young people to learn a musical instrument. It's good. It actually changes and exercises the brain. In the case of musicians, for example, the left planum temporal is bigger than the right one because the emphasis is placed in that area. Musicians develop a way of listening to music which is probably more analytical than your average musical listener. That's just some interesting information. Interesting, when pulsation and syncopation are the rhythmic foundations of music at a dance hall, the movements of the dancers can invariably be seen to become very sensual. And of course, if you're using the types of rhythms that we have been talking about earlier on. And of course, this is probably the world's leading magazine on psychology, scientific magazine entitled Psychology Today. They write concerning rhythms. They say musical rhythms affect both our hearts and our brains. One road to arousing a range of agitated feelings, tense, excited, sometimes sexual, is through pronounced and insistent rhythms. Notice that. Through what kind of rhythms? Pronounced and insistent, repetitious rhythms, artfully used to heighten what they call the sexual tension. Drumming may produce these powerful effects by actually driving the brain's electrical rhythms. New scientists today, last year research comes out of Ben Gurion University in Israel, another leading researcher in this area, Warren Brodsky. Listen to the research which he did. Very interesting, relating to drivers, but it's still interesting. He says, drivers who listen to fast music in their cars may have more than twice as many accidents as those listening to slower tracks. In other words, more laid-back tracks. He goes on to say that as the tempo increased, Brodsky found that drivers took more risks. The tempo ranged from a slow 60 beats a minute, that's the slower ones, to a fast 120 beats a minute or more. That's very interesting because most of the music today which is used in dance halls, in rave, techno, rap music is always 120 beats a minute or more. Because that creates that sense of tension and excitement which is necessary. When I worked in the music industry, it was our aim. If we were writing dance music, we would make sure that the rhythm was 120 beats or more a minute. Made sure about that when you recorded the music. He went on to show, as I have already intimated to you, that he found that heart rates fluctuated when they were exposed to the music and suggests that this has a distracting effect on the drivers. So Yari is relating it in connection to driving, but basically supporting exactly what I've been sharing with you. And of course, this comes from leading research that is done in universities today. You see, the problem here is that a lot of people today who are talking about music, whether it be in churches, in the setting of music and worship, or in your normal day-to-day walk in life, actually don't know anything about it. They've made up their own mind, or they've heard what somebody else says about what music is good and what music is bad, and then they pass it off as if they are an authority on the issue. But they are not. I'm sharing with you the authorities on the issue here this afternoon. From the historical point of view, from the scientific point of view, and you'll hear it from the people themselves in the industry. So that's the authority. Don't go to somebody who doesn't know. Go to the authority and see what they say about the issue. Going back to the voodoo ritual, speaking about this, I would like to emphasize that remember what they said in that statement that I read to you was that it is the music which is seen as the primary source of the occult power. They know that it is in the music. It is the music that actually causes the experience to take place. This basically confirms much of what I've showed you, so I'm not going to go into all of it. But here's something interesting. Why should this rhythm and its connection with voodoo be of any significance in our modern musical context? Let's go to some of the history very quickly. Because I mentioned to you that it came via Africa. It happened through the slave trade era. And these guys who you heard on the interview have basically told you what I'm going to share with you. So I'm going to go through it very briefly. But basically in the 1800s, slaves were sold to the white merchants in the West Indies. And were brought to the West Indies, Haiti, Cuba, Santo Domingo, and some of these places. Later on, of course, they came particularly via New Orleans into North America as well. And of course, when they came, they brought their tribal music and customs with them. And of course, the music underwent some changes and became more westernized, but the basic musical principles remained in the music. In fact, the term voodoo was not something that was coined in Africa. The term voodoo became known in North America and in these countries, South America as well. It comes from the term Vodun, and the Vodun are called the lesser gods or the demons which they worship, the spirit beings or the spirits of the ancestors. Okay, this is basically sharing with you some of the information that I've already told you, but at some time, it was that this whole type of music found its way into North America. The North Americans, because it was a Protestant country, as you heard in the recording earlier on, did not allow the drums to be used by the slaves because of the way in which they used the drums. They used it in their military music, of course, they themselves did. But the way in which it was used by the slaves was not allowed, so they took the drums away from the slaves. But it kind of started resurfacing in New Orleans, which was, interestingly enough, a Catholic city in North America. You heard the statement they made regarding the Catholic Church, which allowed these rhythms to take place because they found that they could actually agree on many things that these people were doing in their pagan practices for obvious reasons, as you know if you've studied prophecy and if you've studied the Bible, which we don't want to get in now, we're dealing with music. And it was at a place called Congo Square in New Orleans where this thing really took off in North America. And what would happen in Congo Square is that the slaves would gather there, and the music that they brought with them from Africa started undergoing a type of a metamorphosis. And in the tribal ceremonies, of course, there was no audience. But because the slave owners would not allow the worship practice to take place, it took on another form. So they would use westernized instruments, and then they would have what would look like a concert. the musicians would play the music, and the audience, although they did not appear to be worshipping, it kind of became a secret within the music, as it says. Now the religious African element, which was still present, became a secret within the music rather than the object of the music. Because the visible elements of ritual worship were now hidden, a much wider audience could accept the African music that was being used in New Orleans at the time. And of course in New Orleans at that time, many dances developed there at Congo Square. One of the dances that developed in New Orleans was known as the samba. And it was actually dedicated to the god Simbi, which was the god of seduction and fertility. There was also the conga, another dance, which was named after the African demon Congo. Of course, there's a country in Africa which is named after that same god. And the mamba, which was named after the voodoo priestess who offered sacrifices to demons during the pagan rituals which took place. Many other types of dances which we experience and use today found their roots in pagan ritual dancing, which actually developed in Congo Square in New Orleans back in those times. Now, of course, it is interesting that many of these practices slowly but surely started becoming incorporated into Christianity as well. In the early days, the black people who were in North America at that time were not allowed to have their own worship practices, as I showed you. But many of them became Christianized. And in some of the cases, they started using their ancient pagan ritual rites with regards to the music in the worship services that they were having in the Christian context. And of course, this happened largely at these great big outdoor camp meetings which took place. Thousands of people would come there. And then, of course, the slaves would have their own camp meeting on the side where they would be banging out their rhythms on gourds and logs while the slave owners were having their worship meetings. And of course, this is not in justification of slavery. It was a disgusting practice. But this is what happened, and of course, this is an historical record of it. And so while the slave owners were singing hymns in careful measures out of the hymn books, the slaves were shouting and the same songs and beating out counter rhythms on tambourines and gourds and logs, having their meetings as well. But ultimately, this concept started becoming integrated into the Western worship liturgy as well, Christian worship liturgy. So their praise and worship services slowly but surely incorporated some of these ideas. And it was at this time in North America in the 1800s where we started witnessing the frenzy of these revival meetings, which incorporated the holy flesh movement and the holy flesh concept, which when you were possessed by the Holy Spirit, you couldn't sin. And so they would actually run around naked at the camp meetings and have this banging and noise. You will remember if you read the testimony, Sister White writes about a Seventh Adventist camp meeting in the 1800s, the Indiana camp meeting which took place, where she wrote about this noise. They were banging on a big bass drum. And she started warning people about the holy flesh movement which was around at that time. And she said that this was the kind of music which would be witnessed in the churches just before the close of probation. Okay, so we even have some of this in our Adventist history. But what ultimately happened is that a style of Christian worship developed from this combination of the voodoo ritual, and I'll read this to you as it's stated. The symbols of voodoo changed, but the frenzy involved in the style of worship and musical expression remained intact. Visible possession by the so-called Holy Ghost was as much a formal goal in the religion of the Southern Holiness churches as possession was in voodoo. In other words, if you didn't speak in tongues, if you didn't roll around on the floor, if there was not some physical manifestation of the Holy Spirit, you were not saved, you were not converted, you were not in possession of the gift. Okay, it became just as important as it was in voodoo ritual. So the ecstasy of speaking in tongues, the uttering of unintelligible syllables or glossolalia, whatever you like to call it, that accompanied this Pentecostal movement, and the other physical manifestations of possession were the same symptoms that were manifest in those people who became possessed by the gods in African ritual ceremonies. In African ritual ceremonies, they speak in tongues, by the way. They fall on the ground on their backs and they speak in garbled language, exactly the same as you find in these And the way that it happened in the early Southern churches in this movement was through the combining of these different elements, Christian and pagan, as it were. It goes on to say that that the uttering of unintelligible syllables that accompany this Pentecostal movement and the other physical manifestations of possession were the same symptoms as manifest by those people who became possessed by the gods in African ritual ceremonies. And this religion, based on ecstasy of feeling, was a survival of, if not the rites, then at least the religious behavior of a pagan worship form that believes in the crossroads where the physical and spiritual worlds meet and blend into one. Interesting, this is, and by the way, this is recorded history. You can read about the early history of the American churches and I'll give you that information. It's recorded history of how it all came into being. In fact, you read in the history of Christianity, one of the leading books on this whole issue. The modern Pentecostal movement grew out of the holiness movement, which I've just described to you, of the late 19th century. The Kentucky revival was characterized by what? Falling, jerking, rolling, running, whining, whooping, holy laughter, and barking exercises. And by the way, for those of you who know what the Toronto Blessing Experience is, that's what it's all about. Laughing in the spirit, rolling around on the floor, all these physical manifestations are just a repetition of that which happened back in those times. And of course, it's ironical, but this whole concept has found its way back to Christianity in Africa as well. You can read about that in one of the Time magazines that came out in the year 2000. Now, very quickly, regarding the connection with this and the secular music scene. I am supposed to stop at 4 o'clock, but we're going to go on for a few more minutes. It won't be too much longer. Regarding how this music became absorbed into Western secular music, let me spend a little bit of time. It was via the blues, which actually became the expression or form of music which was used by the slaves during the 1800s. Via the blues, which ultimately developed into jazz music, then finally came into our modern popular forms, rock and roll, rhythm and blues and so on, and into rock and so on, that this progressed. And I'm not going to say too much about this, but it's interesting. There were some colloquialisms and terms which were used in Congo Square, for example, in the music, which were veiled, which no Westerner would understand. And as a result, the white listeners who heard them, as it's stated in here in the statement, could not understand the full meaning or terminology of the words and, of course, what the song was actually saying. Today, in our modern music, we use these terminologies all the time, and most musicians, even in the music industry, don't know what they mean, let alone Christians who are using this kind of music themselves. For example, here are just some of the terminologies which were used in the song which actually had something to do with sexuality or demon worship. The term funky, for example, which was used by them in their music. And today, have you heard of funky music? Musicians will talk about playing a funky rhythm. Okay? Well, this is what it means. A funky actually means positive sweat, as they say it, or strong smell with strong sexual connotations. I don't want to go into detail about that, but that's what it means. As well, mojo. In fact, it was Jim Morrison who wrote the song Get Your Mojo Working. I think it was Jim Morrison, The Doors, that time. Well, the mojo is this, and now you'll understand what Jim Morrison may have been talking about. The mojo is a soul or an object which was seen to be invested with spiritual power and the capacity to heal or influence, and represented the male's sexual organ. It was a phallic symbol, the mojo. Now you'll understand what Jim Morrison was talking about when he says get your mojo working. So the fact is this, is that even the musicians involved, they understood the history behind this stuff. They're going to tell you themselves a little bit later on. I'm not going to leave you in the dark regarding that. But I want to impress upon you so clearly that everything you are dealing with today is finding its roots in something which actually goes right back to dark pagan worship. That's what it's all about. That's where the roots come from. The word boogie. Have you heard of the term boogie? You might have heard of the boogeyman, right? The boogeyman is a spook or a demon, but that's exactly what it is. Boogie is to feel devilishly good, or another term for a devil or a demon. That's where the boogeyman term comes from. Now let me give it to you in their language. A musician might say, speaking to somebody who knew the terminology, might say, let's play a funky rhythm, the one with strong sexual connotations, and maybe then the people will boogie, dance, in other words, and they will feel devilishly good. And perhaps as a result of that, they may get their mojos working. You understand what I'm trying to say? That is what it really means. I don't mean it to be amusing, but that's basically what the terminology boils down to. Right. What about the word juke? Have you heard of a jukebox? Okay, early rock and roll terminology. All of it finds its roots in pagan ritual worship. Juke was actually something which meant bad, devilishly, or the devil. That's what the juke was, the juke. And hence the term jukebox, which actually meant the devilish box. Remember, in ancient voodoo ritual, they believed that it was through the music that the whole crossroads spiritual experience was caused to happen, through the music. The jukebox was the box with the devils inside because it was where the music was happening. That was what inspired the experience in voodoo ritual, and the whole concept is transferred into our modern popular music ideology. So there we go, in terminology. And not to mention the term jazz itself. Jazz was actually a term which represented an immoral act, or was another term for sexual intercourse. That's what jazz means. And if people said, let's do jazz in a musical setting, it means let's play sexual music. That's what it meant. So, or if a guy was talking to a girl, whatever the case may be, and says, let's do jazz, it meant basically, let's have sexual intercourse. That's what it means. And by the way, the very term rock and roll, I will repeat this once again in our second seminar very briefly, because I'll read the statement to you from its original source. Rock and roll was a term that actually started life as a black American expression for sexual intercourse. That's what rock and roll meant. It came from the early days where they used to go to the drive-in cinema, and they would then rock and roll on the back seat of the car. They would call it rocking and rolling. And that term was transformed or transferred to the music form rock and roll. It fitted because the roots came from the same place. So rock and roll, or rock in other words, actually means sex. That's what it means, basically. So people today, it amazes me that people will talk about Christian rock, Christian jazz, and all these kinds of things, when they, in actual fact, when you go to the meaning of the word, it means Christian sex. Because that's what the words mean. You see, what I'm trying to impress upon you is we are doing things today without realizing where it comes from. And that's why I posed the question earlier on, is where are we picking our fruit? Where does the inspiration come from? From the vine, which is Jesus Christ, or from the orchard of Satan himself? Very important question. Speaking about jazz, it surfaced in New Orleans through the musical style of Buddy Bolden and found its roots and inspiration in the blues. That's where it came from. In fact, what Buddy Bolden played was nothing more than jazz itself, well, blues in essence. And his was a religious African musical concept that was delivered in the sound package of Western music. That was the metamorphosis that I explained to you. So all the features of voodoo ritual remain intact. In fact, Cecil Taylor, some of you may have heard of Cecil Taylor, very famous jazz pianist, one of the most famous jazz pianists, speaking about the spirituality involved in improvisation. And by the way, improvisation is a very important part in jazz, a very important part in voodoo ritual, drumming and music as well, where everything that is being improvised is taking place on that foundation guiding pulse, and the improvisation takes place within that framework. This is what he says about it. Now, please bear in mind that I am quoting to you a jazz musician who is one of the most well-known, respected musicians in the industry. Okay? Listen to what he says. Most people don't have any idea what true improvisation is. It means the magical lifting of one's spirit to a state of trance. Right. It means experiencing oneself as another kind of living organism. It has to do with religious forces. It is about magic, and it is about capturing spirits. And he's talking about jazz music, let alone rock, heavy metal, rap, techno, rave. He's talking about jazz. What I'm trying to say is that the concept or the whole idea behind the music is fully understood by those that are involved. These are the roots. If you look at the development of the music throughout the year, by the way, this is taken from a book written by Joachim E. Barent, who is the leading historian in jazz and contemporary music, and he's one of the leading musicians in the world today in this area. Here he shows us the three main elements, the blues, the rock, and of course the jazz world, and how they grew. Blues, of course, developed first folk blues, the early blues, the classic type blues, then went into the early 1900s and you went to ragtime, Dixieland, which came out of that swing, bebop, cool, hard bop, and then of course you came down to the 1940s where rhythm and blues came in, and from rhythm and blues we went into the 50s where rock and roll came in, and then blues rock, rock funk, pop rock, metal, thrash, disco, rap, techno, rave, right down to our present forms of music. All because they came from the same roots. For example, Joachim E. Barent writes in his book, He says, taking an active interest in jazz, because of course he's referring to jazz as the root, he says, means working for a majority because the popular music of our times feeds on jazz, these musical elements. And you'll find out why. He says, all the music we hear on television series, top 40 radio, hotel lobbies, elevators, commercials, movies, all the music that we dance to, from the Charleston, rock, disco, funk, all those sounds that daily engulf us, all that music comes from jazz. Why? Because beat came to Western music through jazz. And of course he's referring to the type of beat that has been under discussion here this afternoon in our seminar. So there we find it coming straight out of the horse's mouth. And that's just another picture of the development, so I'm not going to worry too much about this. Final question, final category in our seminar now, before we take a little break. And that is, you have heard the evidence of the scientific side of things. You have seen the historic evidence. You've heard it from history books that write about it. You have heard it from people who are in the music industry. You heard the interview who told you about it themselves. You have heard about all this evidence from all these perspectives. Now I want to see if the overwhelming evidence of the musical industry itself supports what I have shown you, shared with you thus far. You see, because afterwards you could say, well, I don't really believe what the music industry says, or rather, I don't believe what the scientific fraternity says. I don't care about that. Well, fine. I mean, if you want to cut off your nose to spite your face, that's your problem. Or you might say, well, I'm just not interested in the history about it. It's not true. Well, basically what you're going to do in the end is, I don't believe the science, I don't believe the history, and at the end, if you don't believe the musical industry, that means you believe nobody. And basically you have to just make up your own mind, which means it's totally uneducated. I'm giving you evidence so that you can make the decision based on evidence, not based on what you want to believe or disbelieve. Evidence is what educates us. So let's go through all the different areas in the music industry and let's see what the musicians themselves take. From jazz, rock and roll, blues, all the way through to our modern music forms, rap, disco, rave. Let's see if they support what I've been showing. We go to the jazz industry. Of course, nobody probably more famous in the jazz industry than Duke Ellington, and he speaks about the rhythm. Interesting thing that he says, a question he poses, he says, rhythm came from Africa to America. Do you know what it does to you? He says exactly what it's supposed to do. Well, I wonder what that is. Of course, we have some idea already what it's meant to be. Does he support the origins and the history? Absolutely. Came from Africa to America. That's where the roots came from, and that's how it found its way into modern music. Little Richard. You couldn't get a better authority on this issue than one of the early pioneers in rock and roll music than Little Richard. In fact, many people recognize him as the originator of rock and roll. Not Elvis Presley or Bill Haley and the Comets. He was the one who was really the beginner or the starter of the whole thing. He says, listen to this very carefully, he says, my true belief about rock and roll, and there have been a lot of phrases attributed to me over the years, is this. I believe that this kind of music is demonic. A lot of the beats in music today are taken from voodoo, from the voodoo drums. If you study music in rhythms like I have, then you will see that this is true. So, one of the leading authorities in the rock and roll music industry seem to support what I've been telling you today. And by the way, these are just samples. Just samples. 60s and 70s rock pop music. Let's go to John Lennon. He has an authority. He says rock and roll is primitive and has no bull. In other words, there's no pretense about it. It's primitive and has no bull. It gets through to you. Its beat comes from where? From the jungle, and they have rhythm. Of course, he understood exactly what we understand. It comes from the African origins, the jungle origins of the kind of music. Now listen to this very interesting one. Let's go to some industry management. And this is probably one of the most well-known, respected managers in the record music industry by the name of Malcolm McLaren. What does Malcolm McLaren say? He says, rock and roll, listen to very carefully, rock and roll is pagan and primitive and very jungle. And that is how it should be. The moment it stops being those things, it is dead. Now listen to what he says. The true meaning of rock is sex, subversion, and style. And of course he means fashion, because fashion is a very important part of the whole concept, the whole package. Now tell me so far, are they confirming what I've been telling you? Absolutely 100%. So it comes from the industry itself. Here's something else. What about rap and hip-hop? Sinead O'Connor, speaking about the origins and inspiration behind rap and hip-hop. Sinead says, hip-hop or rap is the most powerful form of music and communication. It is very spiritual. It has got so many messages within its rhythms, within the drum beats. Oh, who would have thought that a form of music could have these kind of messages within its drum beats? She goes on to say, people don't realize how powerful hip-hop is musically. And that's true, they don't realize it. Absolutely in the dark and ignorant about what it is actually doing to us. Music is, she says, the most powerful form of communication. What about the rave music scene? Come from one of their own sources, Nicholas Saunders, writing in The Guardian. He says, what fascinates me is that the rave culture, seen as purely hedonistic by the establishment, is frequently regarded as a spiritual event by those that are involved. Raves are likened to trance-like tribal rituals where ravers celebrate their unity and shared uplifted state, giving and receiving freely from one another. And by the way, that's the sexual aspect. If you go to raves, you will find it plays a very important role, the giving and receiving freely from one another. All the elements, drugs, sex, music, all the elements that are present in voodoo ritual, in pagan ritual, are to be found in all these practices that we see around us today. And you thought that we were not pagan? I would like to suggest that today we are living in probably the most pagan period of the history of this world. The problem today is that all the pagan practices which are being done have got labels that weren't there in the past. They might call it fashion. Or they might just call it popular music. People will go down to a club where they will spend the whole night going to semi-trance dancing and moving around on the dance floor and going and maybe taking drugs and so on. Exactly the practice that the things they did at pagan ritual, they'll do there. But it's entertainment, it's dancing, it's just a club. But actually, it's like going to a pagan temple. That's really what it is. Because you are partaking of exactly the same things, physical manifestations and everything else that took place in pagan ritual. Trance music. Wonder why they call it trance music. Trance music is currently exploding into the techno mainstream, but it has existed for how long? Since man could first whack a drum. It is about feeling, euphoria, and spontaneous levitation of the senses. That means trance. Through repetition and organic sounds. Now having mated with the sleek machine of techno, it is about the future. Robert Palmer, another famous musician, Rolling Stone Illustrated, speaking about the history of rock and roll. Here Robert Palmer talks about getting to the very heart of the matter. He turns the whole concept around, though, referring to rock and roll or rock. He says, in a very real sense, rock was implicit in the music. And by the way, what does the word rock mean? Sex, that's what it means. Sexual intercourse. Understand that clearly. You'll hear it more about it in our next seminar. In a very real sense, rock was implicit in the music that the first Africans brought to North America. And implicit in their music were centuries of accumulated rites, rituals, and religious fervor. In a nutshell for us today, the profound conclusion that this will bring us to is that none of us, as God's people with safety, can say that it is okay to take a form of music which found its roots and origins in open pagan ritual worship, can safely say we can bring that into the worship of a holy God in His sanctuary. It is impossible. It is inconceivable in the light of the evidence which I've represented to you, both from a scientific, medical point of view, musicological point of view, from a historical point of view, and from the testimony of the musical industry itself. Absolutely inconceivable. Of course, you have to make up your own mind on this. I'm just telling you what I firmly believe with my heart. And again, I stress, I don't say that everything which is contemporary is bad. But those forms which contain the elements which we have discussed this afternoon are not fit for human consumption. They are not fit for the Christian, because not only do they create the atmosphere that we have discussed, but they actually destroy the body temple, as is been shown through the research which has been done. So you and I need to make decisions about this kind of thing. Let's not place our own human desires, which normally seem to lean towards satisfying the flesh, as the criteria we will use to make our decisions. There is a higher standard, and we're going to look into that standard more and more, and that is a thus saith the Lord, and the clear instruction which He has given His people. Don't miss that tomorrow. That's our last seminar. The next seminar, which we're going to do after a very short break of 10 minutes, It's not as long as this seminar, so you can relax. That seminar is entitled The Mind of the Machine. And what we have done now regarding the music industry has just been touching the tip of the iceberg. What you are going to hear next in our seminar is going to blow it absolutely wide open. No doubt will be left in your mind. So 10 minutes, 4:30, we'll be back. But just before we close, if we could just bow our heads for a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you that you do not leave your people in darkness. You have given us enough information to educate ourselves on the issues that we are facing today. Help us to make an educated decision so that whatever we may do to your honor and your glory. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Brian Newman's book, From Rock and Roll to Rock of Ages, serves as an excellent complement to the video series, Voices of a Dying Planet. Brian Newman's musical compositions can be enjoyed on 4 CDs containing instrumental and vocal arrangements. Amazing Discoveries also carries a full line of videos covering such topics such as creation versus evolution, Bible prophecy, current world events, and a healthier lifestyle. The following titles can be obtained through our online catalog.
For the Father waits over the way to prepare us a dwelling place there in the sweet by and by. On that beautiful shore, in the sweet by and by, we shall meet on that beautiful shore. We shall sing on that beautiful shore. The melodious songs of the blessed, and our spirit shall sorrow no more. Not a sigh for the blessing of rest in the sweet by and by. We shall meet on that beautiful shore in the sweet by and by. We shall meet on that beautiful shore. To our bountiful Father